greatly, and that's why I wanted to get he and President Trump together as soon as possible.
And so when he makes express statements, you tend to believe them?
Yeah, with my limited interaction with him, he seems very honorable.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I hope you make your plane back.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd.
I yield back.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Welcome. Others close to President Trump have made it clear that investigations were in fact part of the conditions for U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including Rudy Giuliani and Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff. So, Ambassador Sondland, at a press conference on October 17th, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney discussed his belief that it's entirely appropriate to politicize U.S. foreign policy. Ambassador, how often did you speak or meet with Mr. Mulvaney?
Again, based on my lack of records, I'm going by a bad memory.
Just based on your memory.
I only think I had one formal meeting with Mr. Mulvaney, and it had nothing to do with Ukraine. It had to do with a completely unrelated matter.
So, did you have a chance to talk with Mr. Mulvaney about your efforts in the Ukraine?
I think most of our communication were through the stream of emails, which others were on, generally. And I may have seen him at the White House casually and said hello and, kept in touch, but we didn't have a back and forth.
Well, let me ask you this. Was it your sense that Mr. Mulvaney had a direct line to President Trump? He must have as acting chief of staff, is that right?
Of course.
Let us look at what Mr. Mulvaney said during his October 17th press conference.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
He said that President Trump, in that clip, had an interest in the investigations, did he not?
Apparently, yes.
He's the chief of staff. He's somebody that sees the president and has conversation with the president every single day. Wouldn't you expect that?
Just described as a quid pro quo.
I would expect he has a direct line to the president.
Ambassador Sondland, when did you first learn from Mr. Mulvaney that the investigations were holding up the security assistance, if at any time?
I don't know that I heard it from Mr. Mulvaney.
Okay. And Ambassador Sondland, I know that you're not a career Foreign Service officer. Is it your understanding that the U.S. government conditions security assistance on an investigation into a political rival all the time?
I've already testified I didn't think that would be proper.
All right. Well, let us also see what Mr. Mulvaney had to say about that at the same press conference.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
I'll just go ahead and read it for you because this thing. I'll read it. He says, and I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. Knowing what you know now about what was intended with Ukraine, do you agree with Mr. Mulvaney that there's just going to be political influence in foreign policy, or that we should all just get over it and allow a president now or later to investigate a political rival and ask a foreign government to do that? Do you agree with Mr. Mulvaney?
I think there's a big difference between political influence and investigating a rival, because politics enters into everything relating to foreign policy.
So, but you disagree that you agree that the president should not be allowed to ask for the investigation of a political rival?
In the context of what was going on in Ukraine, I believe that the president should not investigate a political rival in return for a quid pro quo.
And part of the way that you figured out that all of this stuff that was going on, that you were part of something that was basically wrong, is because in the July 25th phone call, the president himself, he didn't tell you, we don't know if he told Rudy Giuliani or not, because Rudy Giuliani won't come in here. He said directly to the president of Ukraine that he wanted the Bidens investigated. Wasn't that your reading of the call?
First of all, I don't believe that I was a part of something that was wrong, because based on what I knew, I thought we were operating well within the center lane of proper U.S. diplomacy.
I yield back.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Chairman, thank you. Ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement issued this morning from the Office of the Vice President by Chief of Staff Mark Short.
Without objection.
Ambassador Sondland, I'll be brief. In anticipation of Mr. Holmes's testimony tomorrow about this July 26 phone call that he overheard at a cafe in Kiev that you had with President Trump, he overheard that even though the call was not on speakerphone, correct?
I don't believe so.
All right. Was it an open-air cafe?
It was outdoors.
One of the points that my Democratic colleagues keep making is that David Holmes's prior testimony, which he'll apparently confirm tomorrow, is that President Trump said that he doesn't give a blank about Ukraine. You heard that earlier?
That was not on the phone call. I don't think he testified that was on the phone call. I think he was testifying that I summarized the phone call, and I don't recall saying that.
And you have no recollection of that?
I don't.
Yeah. Even if it was true, there's nothing wrong with that, to have an opinion about.
He can have whatever opinion he wants about Ukraine.
It's all part of the narrative that President Trump is a bad guy, that he doesn't care about the Ukrainians. But it seems to me, Ambassador Sondland, that nothing says you care more about the Ukrainians than sending Javelin anti-tank missiles. Do you agree with me?
I agree that sending Javelin anti-tank missiles is something the Ukraine wanted and needed.
Certainly, those work a lot better in stopping Russian tanks than the blankets that were sent by the Obama administration.
Your point is taken.
I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, thank you for your stamina, sir. I have a few quick, fairly easy questions. You would agree, would you not, sir, that foreign interference in our elections is or can be a threat to our democracy?
Under certain conditions, yes.
There are conditions under which their interference is not a threat?
I'm sorry, did you say foreign interference?
Yes.
Always, sorry.
And do you also agree that identifying and preventing that interference should be a priority of the federal government?
It should be one of its priorities.
And when you were assisting President Trump in his effort to obtain those investigations, did you at all realize that those investigations could in fact impact the 2020 election?
No.
Do you believe, sir, that it is appropriate, ever appropriate, to invite, press, bribe, or coerce foreign interference in our elections?
No.
Thank you. I want to refer to something that you said in your opening statement. As I previously testified, had I known of all of Mr. Giuliani's dealings or of his associations with individuals now under criminal indictment, I would not have acquiesced to his participation. It's hard to read that without believing that you thought that what he was doing was either wrong or that he was not reputable. Fair?
Well, with 2020 hindsight, that's fair.
Yes. You've testified here today that you also came to believe that the request for investigations into Burisma was in fact a request to investigate the Bidens, both former Vice President and Hunter. And indeed, the transcript of the July 25th call makes specific reference to that, including Hunter Biden. And today, even the ranking member said we could clear all this up if we could have Hunter Biden. And I have a simple question. What Ukrainian law did Hunter Biden violate?
I'm not aware.
What evidence is there that he may have violated any Ukrainian law?
I'm not aware.
That's because there is none, sir. Finally, also from your opening statement, you said, As you know, I have already provided 10 hours of deposition testimony. I did so despite directives from the White House and the State Department that I refused to appear, as many others have done. I agreed to testify because I respect the gravity of the moment, and I believe I have an obligation to account fully for my role in these events. By obligation, you mean simply your legal obligation, or did you mean something bigger?
Well, both my legal obligation and my moral obligation.
Your moral obligation. I actually want to present an alternative theory. Your family came here escaping the Holocaust via Uruguay, and your parents moved Lucy and later you here, where, frankly, you've been an American success story through dint of hard work and innovation, good idea, a knack to hire the right people, and some luck. You've built a considerable, successful business, one that I know for a fact would make your parents proud. They came here because they knew that it was here that they could have freedom that they had not enjoyed, security that they had not enjoyed, an opportunity that they had not enjoyed. And no doubt, on some level, you're grateful, and it's created a sense of patriotism in you. Is that fair to say?
Very fair.
Why then, sir, with your courage to come before us, does that same standard not apply to Mr. Mulvaney, Mr. Duffy, Mr. Pompeo, Mr. Bolton, Mr. Vogt, Mr. Giuliani? Why shouldn't those same sentiments beat within their hearts to do their patriotic duty and do what you have done, sir? Indeed, why doesn't that same standard apply to the President of the United States?
I wish I could answer.
I suspect you can't because there is no good answer. But I do appreciate your willingness to come here today. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney.
Without objection, we haven't seen all these statements, but presume they are accurate and no objection.
Thank you. Ambassador, President Trump's not a big fan of foreign aid. Is that right?
I don't know if that's a fair characterization. I think he's careful.
He's
when it
expressed
comes to-
concerns about foreign
Yeah.
aid going to certain countries. Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. And he knew Ukraine was corrupt. Is that right?
He believed Ukraine was corrupt.
Yeah, and he wanted Europe to do more?
Definitely.
Definitely wanted Europe to do more. And the president had a belief that Ukrainian government officials, some senior Ukrainian government officials, supported his opponent in 2016. I won't go into all the details, but I think of the one member of parliament who said the majority of Ukrainian politicians want Hillary Clinton to win. So he had that belief as well. And obviously he understood what was happening. We got a brand new guy in Ukraine. This Zelensky guy wins, right?
Right.
And his party takes over, and President Trump wants to see, with all these other things that are of concern to him, he wants to see if this new guy is actually, as I like to say, the real deal, a real reformer, and actually going to deal with the corruption problem. So aid gets held up for 55 days. Gets held up on July 18th, and then is released on September 11th. But it seems to me more important than the 55-day pause is the 14 days when Ukraine realized aid was held up on the 29th. We've now had you testify to that. The two witnesses yesterday testified that, the Politico article. So aid gets held up on Ukraine learns aid is held on August 29th, and then, of course, released on September 11th. In those 14 days, there are 3 important meetings with senior government officials and President Zelensky. There's the August 29th meeting between Ambassador Bolton and President Zelensky. There's the meeting September 1st that you're a part of. Vice President Pence meets with President Zelensky. And then there's the meeting on September 5th where U.S. Senators Murphy and Johnson meet with President Zelensky. None of those meetings did any linkage to security assistance dollars and an announcement or start of any investigation ever come up. None of them. But it seems to me the one that's the most important is probably the one we've talked least about, and that's the September 5th meeting. Because that's actually a meeting where there is no one, well, it's much more congressional focused than White House focused. This is the meeting where Senators Murphy and Johnson, bipartisan, meet with President Zelensky. And what's interesting is what both senators in the last 2 days have given us letters recounting what happened in that meeting. Senator Murphy said, I broached the topic of pressure on Zelensky from Rudy Giuliani and the president's other emissaries to launch investigations into Trump's political rival. Murphy brought it up. You got two senators who both strong supporters of money going to Ukraine. These guys are all for it. And Senator Murphy, the Democrat, even brings up the issue everyone's been talking about. It seems to me if ever there was going to be a time where the president of Ukraine says, guys, you don't know what I'm dealing with. I'm getting pressure from the president of the United States. He wants me to do this. I got to make it. It seems if ever there was a time that the president of Ukraine, the new guy, who now knows the aid has been on hold, if ever there was a time to bring it up, that would have been the time. But guess what? At no time, Senator Johnson tells us, at no time during this meeting or on any other meeting on this trip was there any mention by Zelensky or any other Ukrainian that they were feeling pressure to do anything in return for military aid. Not even, Senator Johnson says, not even after Murphy warned them about getting involved in the election. So Murphy gave this big deal on Giuliani and nothing. And guess what Murphy also said? I do not dispute any of Senator Johnson's factual representations regarding the meeting. If ever it was going to happen, September 5th was the day. No one from the White House there, not Ambassador Bolton, not Vice President, no one there. But even then it didn't happen. And we got all kinds of other meetings when it didn't happen. And of course, as you testified earlier, there was never an announcement. You said there were 3 quid pro quos, but there weren't, because there was never an announcement. I mean, this is as clear as it gets, but these guys want to keep stirring it up based on no direct evidence whatsoever. And the best direct evidence we have is actually what the president told you. I want nothing. There is no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do exactly what he campaigned on. And when that became clear to us, guess what? They got the money. They got the money. God bless America. It all worked out, right? This is crazy what we're going through because the facts are so darn clear. I yield back.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I'm impressed with your career. Been very successful in business. I'm impressed with your commitment to public service. And I was very impressed with your forthright statement. So thank you for that. You said it was the highest honor for you to have this opportunity to have this appointment to serve as ambassador to the EU, correct?
Correct.
And you quickly became very involved in the Ukraine policy. And that policy has been described by you and others, was really very clear. Help Ukraine fight internal corruption and resist external aggression, correct?
Correct.
And this Congress, I think with the support of everybody up here, Republicans and Democrats, and in fact with a significant amount of Republican leadership, authorized the release of military aid, right?
Right.
And you and others who were working with you believed it was very important to the new government, President Zelensky, to have that White House meeting to show our support and send a signal to Russia, correct?
That's correct.
And from hearing you and from hearing our other witnesses, Ambassador Yovanovitch, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Taylor, there was a concerted team effort on your part to get that meeting and release that aid, correct?
Well, there was always a concerted effort on my part to get the meeting. That was my singular narrow focus, was to get the meeting.
Right. And that was shared by all of the colleagues I just mentioned, correct?
Yes.
All right. And incredibly urgent, Ambassador Taylor described going to the front where Ukrainians were dying at the Donbass. 14,000 had died. And it was an existential issue for them that they get the aid. And you were well aware of that and shared, I'm sure, Ambassador Taylor's concern. Is that correct?
I did.
Right. And in your forthright testimony, you've testified and it's really with the benefit of hindsight, because you couldn't piece it all together. You know, Giuliani knew in real time what you were trying to figure out as you went along. Is that a fair statement?
I think so.
One, you testified that you acted on the orders of the president. That was you acting on his orders, correct?
Correct.
And you said quite explicitly there was a quid pro quo.
Relating to the meeting and the Burisma DNC.
That's exactly right. No meeting unless there's an investigation, right?
That's what we were told by Mr. Giuliani.
All right. And Mr. Giuliani, you absolutely...
Wait, no meeting unless there was an announcement of investigation.
Okay, thank you. And I asked, by the way, did the efforts of Mr. Giuliani authorized by the president impede the efforts that you and others were making to try to advance what you thought was the Ukraine policy?
Not initially. We were just working toward...
Ultimately?
Well, ultimately, nothing happened.
Right. And Giuliani was the one who was absolutely insistent on the meeting, correct?
Giuliani was insistent on the...
And the investigations.
Investigation, yeah.
All right. Now, I asked this of Ambassador Taylor or Ambassador Volker. If the mayor of Portland said to the police chief, I'm not going to authorize your budget unless you agree to do an investigation into my political opponent, would that be wrong?
Of course.
And likewise, if it were the governor of the state of Oregon doing the same thing, correct?
Correct.
And would that same rule apply to the President of the United States?
To investigate a political opponent? Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
All right, so that's the question here. The president, in his phone call, he asked President Zelensky, who desperately needed the release of that aid, who desperately needed the White House meeting, to do an investigation, and it was focused on the Bidens and Hunter Biden in Burisma, in CrowdStrike. I mean, you don't have to answer that. The president's words speak for themselves. Do you feel, as a person who went into public service to serve, who had a team of people that shared your desire to help Ukraine, do you feel in any way betrayed by the double dealing of the president? It's a real question.
I don't want to characterize...
You don't have to characterize him. I'm just, you know, we all, if we get a chance to do something useful, we like to do it. And there's no better joy than when you're doing it with other people. And
Mr. Welch, let me answer your question this way. I would have preferred that, and I'm sure everyone would have preferred, that the president simply met with Mr. Zelensky right away. Our assessment of Mr. Zelensky was that he and the president would get on famously. He was smart, he was funny, he was charming, he was the kind of person the president would like, and once the two of them got together, we thought the chemistry would take over and good things would happen between the U.S. and Ukraine relationship. That's why we were pushing for a quick, unconditional meeting.
So it's unfortunate that he was
That it didn't
unwilling to
happen.
meet without the commitment on the investigation. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Ambassador, let's pick up right there. You would have preferred if they just had the meeting with the president of Ukraine without these conditions. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
But there were these conditions, and it involved an investigation, right?
Well, remember,
said that many times.
the initial invitation that the president sent to President
understand, I
Zelensky
understand.
had no conditions.
Well, but that didn't last very long, did it? And then there were conditions. This is not controversial at this point, I don't believe, sir. There were conditions that the
Yes.
president wanted investigations, right?
Right.
And you thought they were Burisma and the 2016 election.
Correct.
We now know, of course, that Burisma means Biden's, right?
Today we do.
And we can probably, from today until the end of time, set aside any confusion that when somebody's asking for an investigation of Burisma over the summer, what they really meant was Biden's, right?
With 2020 hindsight, yes.
Right, with hindsight. And of course, on the day after the president's famous call, you're having lunch with David Holmes, we've covered this, and he overhears your conversation. And I know you said you have no reason to dispute what Mr. Holmes said. And I think you said you wouldn't have any reason to believe, to think you didn't speak about investigations with the president. The president raised investigations with you, right?
Correct.
On the 26th.
Correct.
And we now know, of course, that was about the Bidens and Burisma in 2016, right? I mean, I know you didn't know that at the time, that's your testimony, but we
I
now know that,
understood it
right?
meant to mean Burisma.
Mr. Holmes says you said Biden's right after that, but I know you don't recall that, right?
That's correct.
Do you dispute it?
I do.
Okay, but you don't recall it. But we know that that's what the president meant, right? And you do confirm that he wanted to talk about investigations with you.
Well, now with the complete picture,
I
what he said 24 hours before, yes, it
understand.
makes sense.
And you've said it's wrong to investigate political opponents. We've agreed on that today, haven't we, sir?
Yes.
And yet, of course, that's what we know the president was asking for. Let me ask you something. Who would have benefited from an investigation of the president's political opponents?
I don't want to characterize who would have and who would not have.
I know you don't want to, sir. That's my question. Would you answer it for me?
Restate your question.
Who would benefit from an investigation of the president's political opponent?
Well, presumably the person who asked for the investigation.
Who's that?
If the president asked for the investigation, it would be he.
Well, it's not a hypothetical, is it, sir? We just went around this track, didn't we? The president asked you about investigations. He was talking about the Bidens. When he asked you about the Biden investigation, who was he seeking to benefit?
He did not ask me about the Biden investigation.
When he
I've
asked you
said that
about investigations,
19 times, Mr. Maloney.
Sir, we just went through this. When he asked you about investigations, which we all agree now means the Bidens, we just did this about 30 seconds ago. It's a pretty simple question, isn't it? I guess I'm having trouble why you can't just say.
When he asked about investigations, I assumed he meant
I know what you assumed.
company.
But who would
research.
benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
They're two different questions. Are you-
I'm just asking you one. Who would benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
I assume President Trump would benefit.
There we have it, see? Didn't hurt a bit, did it? Didn't hurt a bit. But let me ask you something.
Mr. Maloney?
Hold on, sir.
Excuse me. I've been very forthright, and I really resent what you're trying to do.
Fair enough. You've been very forthright. This is your third try to do so, sir. Didn't work so well the first time, did it? We had a little declaration come in after, you remember that? And now we're here a third time, and we got a doozy of a statement from you this morning. There's a whole bunch of stuff you don't recall. So all due respect, sir, we appreciate your candor, but let's be really clear on what it took to get it out of you. So my question is, when the president's putting pressure on the Ukrainians, withholding a meeting, to get this investigation that you and I agree would benefit him politically, what kind of position does that put the Ukrainians in, sir?
A terrible position.
Terrible position. Why?
Why does it put them in a terrible position?
Why?
Well, obviously, they're not receiving ultimately what they thought was coming to them, and they're put in a position that jeopardizes their security.
A position that jeopardizes their security, and they're being asked to do an investigation to help their security, essentially, that would benefit the president politically. In other words, you might say they're being asked to give him a personal benefit in exchange for an official act. Is that a fair summary?
In your hypothetical, that's correct.
It's not a hypothetical, sir. This is real life. Were they asked to give him a personal benefit
By
in
whom?
exchange for an official act?
Sir, I am not going to go around in circles with you. Please be clear about what you're asking me.
My time's expired, sir. Thank you for your appearance.
Ms. Demings.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Do you have any knowledge of a possible meeting on or around May 7th involving then President-elect Zelensky and several of his aides to discuss how to handle pressure from President Trump and Mr. Giuliani about investigating the Bidens?
I don't recall such a meeting.
You don't recall such a meeting? You don't recall hearing anything about such a meeting?
Again,
if you don't have firsthand knowledge?
If I don't have record schedules, right now I don't recall anything about such a meeting.
Ambassador, in the May...
Is this a meeting among the Ukrainians?
It's a meeting among the Ukrainians involving then President-elect Zelensky, so this would have been early on in his presidency with several aides to discuss how to handle pressure from President Trump and Mr. Giuliani about investigating the Bidens?
Yeah, I don't recall such a meeting.
You don't remember that. Ambassador, in the May, I believe it was the May 23rd meeting, you talked about how the president categorized Ukraine, what he thought about Ukraine. I believe that meeting was on May 23rd. Did you ever hear President Zelensky relay any concerns about you, about how he felt, about how the United States viewed him, whether he was being taken seriously, or any concerns about being used as a tool for political reasons?
Well, I saw that in an email from Ambassador Taylor. We obviously tried to relay to President Zelensky the glass half full version of how the United States felt about Ukraine, not the glass half empty version, which is we're here for you, we support you, and we're trying very hard to get you the meeting with President Trump.
So after hearing that from Ambassador Taylor, you tried to reassure President Zelensky that America was truly on their side. Is that
I
what you
think we've
just
been
said?
trying to assure President Zelensky throughout his entire term as a president.
Ambassador, I know you said you don't quite remember exactly when you came to the realization that Burisma actually meant Biden's. But back on May 6th, when asked about a news report about the role of former Vice President's son on Burisma, President Trump told Fox News that it was, and I quote, a major scandal, major problem. On May 9th, the New York Times reported that Rudy Giuliani planned to travel to Ukraine and, quote, shortly to meet with President Zelensky to urge him to pursue the 2016 election and the involvement of Hunter Biden in Burisma, unquote. Are you saying that you did not realize at that time, we're talking about on May 9th of this year, that Mr. Giuliani wanted to urge President Zelensky to pursue the 2016 election and the involvement of Hunter Biden of Burisma?
I do now, but I did not then.
You did not know that, and I believe you said earlier that you did not pay any attention or much attention at all to any of the numerous news reports of the person you were directed by the president to work with when he was on television over and over and over again talking about Hunter Biden and Burisma.
No, I did not.
On September 9th, in a text from Ambassador Taylor, he said something to the effect, are we now saying that aid is tied to investigations? And I believe you text back, call me. Then you had a conversation with President Trump. And President Trump said something to the effect that there is no quid pro quo. Do you know what prompted him to say that? You asked him, what do you want? And he goes directly to, there is no quid pro quo, as opposed to going directly to the list of things that he wanted. What prompted him to use that term?
I have no clue.
Did you discuss your conversation or your text from Ambassador Taylor with President Trump before he made that statement?
I did not. I asked a very open-ended question. What do you want from Ukraine?
And you remember that directly, although there are several other conversations that you cannot recall because you don't have your notes or your documents or your emails or other information. But you remember that call specifically, exactly what the president said to you in response to your question about what do you want. Why is that?
I remember the first girl I kissed. I mean, I remember certain things.
Well, I won't say that, but anyway.
I remembered that conversation because, as I said, it was a pretty intense, short conversation.
And tell me again about the conversation you had at the restaurant that was overheard by Mr. Holmes, because that was a conversation with the president. Tell me about that conversation with the president. What was said on the phone?
Again, I don't remember the specifics. I'm being guided by what Mr. Holmes testified to. I said I didn't dispute the basic, subject of the conversation. As I said, we were talking primarily about ASAP Rocky. That was a completely unrelated matter, and I think the president may have brought up, how did it go with Zelensky, or is he going to do the investigations, which we'd been talking about for weeks. And then, as I said, I dispute the Mr. Holmes' characterization of what I said afterwards.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm just going to pick up on that September 9th conversation, which the president allegedly said, "I want nothing. I don't want a quid pro quo." I presume that on this September 9th conversation, the president did not mention that that was the same day that we launched a congressional investigation into whether there was a quid pro quo. Did he say that to you?
Again, I know all of that today, but he did not. We didn't have a time to talk about things like
And
that.
I presume he also didn't mention the whistleblower complaint that also alleged that there was a quid pro quo that day.
He did not.
Okay. So you can't rule out the possibility that the reason why he started talking that way on that day is because of the congressional investigation.
I can't rule that out.
You know, the inauguration of President Zelensky was on May 20th, correct?
Correct.
As you stated, you attended this inauguration with Senator Johnson, Secretary Perry, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, and others, right?
Correct.
But Vice President Pence was supposed to originally attend that, correct?
I believe so.
We learned from Jennifer Williams, a witness who testified, that it was at the president's direction on May 13th that the vice president not attend. She said, quote, that according to the vice president's chief of staff, the president determined that the vice president would not go. Do you know why the vice president did not attend the inauguration?
No clue.
I want to point to a New York Times article from last week that says that Lev Parnas' attorney, you've heard of this gentleman, Lev Parnas, an associate of Rudy Giuliani. Who's
Only what I've read very recently.
He's recently indicted.
Yeah.
Mr. Parnas told a representative of the incoming government, the Zelensky government, that it had to announce an investigation into Trump's political rival, Joseph R. Biden, and his son, or else Vice President Mike Pence would not attend the swearing-in of the new president, and the United States would freeze aid. Did the Vice President not attend possibly because this investigation had not yet been initiated by the Zelensky government?
I have no idea.
You can't rule it out, right?
Again, I have no idea.
You have no basis for ruling it out, however, correct?
All I know is that the leader of the delegation was Secretary Perry, who invited me along.
Interestingly, Ambassador Sondland, since you came forward in these proceedings, others in the administration have tried to distance themselves from you. You know, on October 14th, Rudy Giuliani told the Washington Post that Sondland, quote, seemed to be in charge, close quote, of the effort to get Ukrainian officials to publish or to publicly announce investigations. Of course, that's false, correct?
If I had been in charge, I would have asked President Trump to have the meeting without preconditions, and the meeting would have occurred a long time ago.
That's exactly right. The president is the one that wanted these investigations, as we learned later on in reading the July 25th call transcript. Isn't that right?
The president, through Mr. Giuliani, is conveyed through Mr. Giuliani, wanted the investigations.
Mr. Tim Morrison came in yesterday, and in his deposition testimony, as well as yesterday, disparaged you too. He called you, quote unquote, the Gordon problem.
That's what my wife calls me. Maybe they're talking.
He,
Should I be worried?
maybe. You know, on October 8th of this year, the president tweeted that you are a really good man and a great American. And of course, on November 8th, 1 month later, he said, let me just tell you, I hardly know the gentleman.
Easy come, easy go.
You know, what I'm concerned about, you were part of the Three Amigos. But what I'm really concerned about, Ambassador Sondland, is that the president and the good folks over here, my Republican colleagues, are now casting you as the one amigo. The one lonely amigo they're going to throw under the bus. But the truth is that, as you said in your opening statement, the suggestion that you were engaged in some rogue diplomacy or irregular channel of diplomacy is, quote unquote, absolutely false. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
The presumption that military aid was conditioned on investigations was based on Mulvaney's statement that we saw on the video. Isn't that right?
Well, I didn't have the benefit at that time of Mulvaney's statement.
But you would stand by the presumption that you had based on what you know now, right?
Correct.
And on September 1, when you told Andrei Yermak your presumption, which you've told us about military aid being conditioned on the investigations. You then told Mr. Morrison what you told Yermak, and Morrison did not try to dispute your presumption, correct?
I don't recall him disputing it. I think I went right over to him and just repeated the conversation.
And when you told Vice President Pence your concerns, he did not dispute that as well?
He didn't respond. He just listened.
And when you told Secretary Pompeo, that wasn't disputed as well?
I don't recall.
Thank you.
That concludes the member questioning. Mr. Nunes, do you have any closing remarks?
Just briefly, Ambassador, I know you want to get on a plane, so I want to thank you for your indulgence today. Once again, the American people have seen another failure of their preposterous conspiracy theory, which that's if their conspiracy theory doesn't change between now and our next hearing, which is in a few hours from now, or another hour or so, and it keeps changing every day. The claim, Ambassador, that you had you were accused of having an irregular channel, drug deals, now supposedly you're one amigo. Nobody on this side of the aisle claimed that you were one amigo.
I lost my amigos?
Yeah, not from us, not from us. No bribes given to, that you made any bribes to the Ukrainian people or to the Ukrainian president. Your co-conspirator, Kurt Volker. I find it remarkable and troubling how the Democrats and their collaborators in the press have been able to vilify Ambassador Volker, who was supposed to work on these matters in Ukraine, like you, Ambassador. It was a very regular channel, and no amount of storytelling by the left and the Democrats on this dais will change that. It was the regular channel. Testimony received today was far from compelling, conclusive, and provides zero evidence of any of the crimes that have been alleged. In fact, Ambassador Sondland testified that he presumed the temporary pause in military aid was conditioned on Ukraine carrying out the investigations the Democrats are desperate to portray as nefarious. The Democrats have, as their custom, seized on this presumption as proof they can use it against the president. However, Ambassador Sondland testified in his deposition that when he asked President Trump, "What do you want from Ukraine?" President Trump replied, "I want nothing. There is no quid pro quo." Let me repeat. President Trump said, "I want nothing. There is no quid pro quo." This comes on the heels of the testimony by Ambassador Volker that he saw no evidence of bribery, extortion, quid pro quo, or treasonous actions. We didn't get to ask him about obstruction of justice because we didn't know that was on the table until today. Like the president's call with President Zelensky, Democrats want the American people to believe, as one Democrat on this committee put it, that hearsay is much better than direct evidence. And I think Mr. Ratcliffe from Texas laid out the direct evidence that we have from your testimony today. Nothing we have heard establishes a claim that the president acted improperly in his dealings with Ukraine, and certainly nothing has been presented to support anything near impeachment. In the meantime, Mr. Chair, we continue to have no answers to the questions that only you know, starting with who is the whistleblower who gave birth to this hoax and what was the nature of his coordination with the Democrats on this committee. Second, what is the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign in 2016? And finally, why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden? What did he do for them? And did his position impact any U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? Another hearing in the books and no answers to basic three material, factual questions that we need answers to. Yield back, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here.
Thank you.
I thank the ranking member for his remarks. Ambassador Sondland, thank you for your testimony today. This is a seminal moment in our investigation, and the evidence you have brought forward is deeply significant and troubling. It's been a long hearing, and I know Americans watching throughout the country may not have had the opportunity to watch all of it. So I'm going to go through a few of the highlights, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase what you've said. I'm going to refer to your opening statement. We all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose an important opportunity to cement relations between the United States and Ukraine. So we followed the President's orders. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the President. Later, you testified, I tried diligently to ask why the aid was suspended, but I never received a clear answer. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 election and Burisma, as Mr. Giuliani had demanded. I shared concerns of the potential quid pro quo regarding the security aid with Senator Ron Johnson, and I also shared my concern with the Ukrainians. So much for the Ukrainians didn't know. You can't have a quid pro quo unless the Ukrainians know, and you have testified today, Ambassador, the Ukrainians knew. You further testified Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the President wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server and Burisma, as two topics of importance to the President. In reference to the July 10th meeting at the White House, which you attended with Ambassador Bolton and others and the Ukrainian delegation, you said, I recall mentioning the prerequisite of investigations before any White House call or meeting. You further testified, again, Mr. Giuliani's demand that President Zelensky make a public statement about investigations. I knew that the topic of investigations was important to President Trump. You testified later, I know that members of this committee have frequently framed these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and White House meeting, the answer is yes. We all understood these prerequisites for the White House call and White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements. Later, on the subject of security aid, you testified, in the absence of any credible explanation for the hold, I came to the conclusion that the aid, like the White House visit, was jeopardized. In preparation for the September 1 meeting in Warsaw, I asked Secretary Pompeo whether a face-to-face conversation between Trump with Zelensky could help break the logjam. And this is from an email that the State Department refuses to provide to us, but you have provided to us, Ambassador. It reads, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye, that is the President, and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place in mid-September, that Z should be able to move forward publicly with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the United States. Hopefully, that will break the logjam. And Secretary Pompeo's reply, yes. Not what issues of importance to the POTUS, not what are you talking about, Ambassador Sondland, because Secretary Pompeo was on the July 25th phone call. He knew. what issues were important to POTUS, and there were two of them: the investigation into 2016 and the DNC server, and the investigation into the Bidens. By the end of August, you testified, my belief was that if Ukraine did something to demonstrate a serious intention to fight corruption, specifically addressing Burisma and the 2016 server, then the hold on military aid would be lifted. I mentioned to Vice President Pence before the meetings with Ukrainians that I had concerns that the delay in aid had become tied to the issue of investigations. And as you testified, he gave you no response. No, what are you talking about, Ambassador? How could that be, Ambassador? How do we clear this up, Ambassador? He merely nodded his head or took it in. And of course, the record of that 25th call between President Trump and Zelensky was in the Vice President's reading book earlier. Then you testified, my goal at the time was to do what was necessary to get the aid released, to break the logjam. I believe that the public statement we have been discussing for weeks was essential to advancing that goal. Now, my colleagues seem to believe, and let me add too about this call you had with the President, you have confirmed today, in addition to claiming there was no quid pro quo, the President was adamant that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. That's what you have confirmed. That is what you also told Ambassador Taylor. So he would deny there was a quid pro quo, but he was adamant that Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. Now, I've said a lot of things about President Trump over the years. I have very strong feelings about President Trump, which are neither here nor there. But I will say this on the President's behalf. I do not believe that the President would allow himself to be led by the nose by Rudy Giuliani or Ambassador Sondland or anybody else. I think the President was the one who decided whether a meeting would happen, whether aid would be lifted, not anyone who worked for him. And so the answer to the question, who was refusing the meeting with Zelensky that you believe should take place, and Ambassador Volker believes should take place, and everybody believes should take place? The only question was when. Who was the one standing in the way of that meeting? Who was the one refusing to take that meeting? There's only one answer to that question, and it's Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. So who was holding up the military assistance? Was it you, Ambassador Sondland? No, it wasn't. Was it Ambassador Volker? No. Was it Ambassador Taylor? No. Was it Deputy Secretary Kent? No. Was it Secretary of State Pompeo? No. Who had the decision to release the aid? It was one person, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Now, my colleagues seem to think unless the President says the magic words, I hereby bribe the Ukrainians, that there's no evidence of bribery or other high crimes or misdemeanors. But let's look to the best evidence of what's in the President's head. What's his intent? What's the reason behind the hold on the meeting and on the aid? Let's look at what the President has to say. Let's look at what's undisputed about what the President has to say. And you know how we know what the President has to say? Not because what you have represented or others have represented, but because we have a record of his conversation. And with who? The one who really matters. With the other president, Zelensky. And this is what he says. He says, Rudy very much knows what's happening. And he is a very capable guy. This is after he says he wants a favor. And he goes into CrowdStrike in 2016. He says, Rudy very much knows what's happening and is a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great. The former ambassador from the United States, the woman was bad news. And the people she was dealing with in Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General, that would be great. Biden went about bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you could look into it, it sounds horrible to me. So what's in the President's mind when he has placed this otherwise inexplicable hold on the aid when he refuses to take the meeting. What's on his mind? Biden. He makes that abundantly clear. I understand, Ambassador, you said you didn't make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I will let the American people judge the credibility of that answer. But there's no mistaking what Donald Trump's interest was. There's no mistaking about what Donald Trump meant when he had that call with you on an unsecure phone as you're sitting there in an outdoor terrace in Ukraine. When the president said investigation, he meant Biden. He made that abundantly clear to the president of Ukraine the day before. The question is not what the president meant. The question is not whether he was responsible for holding up the aid. He was. The question is not whether everybody knew it. Apparently they did. The question is, what are we prepared to do about it? Is there any accountability? Or are we forced to conclude that this is just now the world that we live in, when a president of the United States can withhold vital military aid from an ally at war with the Russians, an ally fighting our fight too, to defend our country against Russian aggression? Are we prepared to say, in the words of Mick Mulvaney, get over it or get used to it? We are not prepared to say that. We're not prepared to say that. And I appreciate Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, I appreciate the fact that you have not opined on whether the president should be impeached or not be impeached, or whether the crime of bribery or the impeachable offense of bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors has been committed. That is for us to decide in consultation with our constituents and our conscience. That is for us to decide. And much as my colleagues have said otherwise, this is not an easy decision for any of us. And much as my colleagues may say otherwise, this is not something we relish. For over a year, I resisted this whole idea of going down the road to impeachment. But it was made necessary, and not by the whistleblower, but by the actions of the president. I'm continually struck how my colleagues would suggest that because the president got caught, we should ignore the fact that he was conditioning official acts in order to get political favors, in order to get an investigation against his rival. Getting caught is no defense, not to a violation of the Constitution or to a violation of his oath of office, and it certainly doesn't give us a reason to ignore our own oath of office. We are adjourned.